You mentioned the 1916 Rising, and obviously when we look at that, we have to look at that in the context of the war. That was a rebellion that took place while Britain was at war, and therefore that dictated the response or coloured the response.
Absolutely. I mean, there's this extraordinary, emblematic story which I think symbolises just how little Ireland counts by that stage. The Easter weekend of 1916, Asquith was in his country house and he was preparing a speech, a very important speech, because the British realised they couldn't get enough volunteers anymore and they were going to have to introduce compulsory military service conscription. And he was drafting his speech. And when he got back to Downing Street on Easter Monday night, he went in and somebody said to him, "Oh, Prime Minister, there's been a rebellion in Ireland. Many of the buildings have been taken over." And Asquith just turned and said, "Well," he said, "that's something," and went to bed. And that encapsulates the utter inability of Ireland to command the attention of British government ministers, not just for as long as the war goes on, but also throughout the peace conference in 1919. Lloyd George spends most of 1919, he's now Prime Minister, and he spends most of 1919 in Paris.
And that's a problem for Irish historians when they're looking at it, because obviously Irish people think that their
it's a
issues
huge problem, because it's very hard for well, especially for Irish nationalists, it's very, very hard for people, no matter how much history they know or how well educated they are, it's very hard for them to appreciate that the British government did not regard anything that happened in Ireland between 1916 and 1919, which is the Easter Rising, the executions, it's Sinn Féin winning a majority of the Irish seats in the general election of 1918, the establishment of the first Dáil in January 1919, that none of these things command the attention of the British government and of British ministers. And it's very hard for people to understand that.
You mentioned the executions. I suppose they should be seen in the context of the war as well, at a time when
Absolutely.
British soldiers who were accused of desertion were being shot in France.
Absolutely. Yeah.
It's
But I mean, virtually, I mean, the war, the phrase I use in the book, the tentacles of the war spread into almost every house in Britain, including 10 Downing Street. Prime Minister's eldest son is killed. Many of his cabinet colleagues, their sons are killed. And the scale of not just the executions, but the scale of casualties in Ireland, compared with what's happening on the Western Front, is minuscule. There was a Liberal minister, a member of Lloyd George's cabinet, the day the treaty was signed in 1921. He went to the War Office and he said, "Can you tell me the total number of British casualties since 1916? That's from 1916 to 1921. And they said, "Can't give it to you immediately, but if you come back this afternoon, we'll have it for you." It's in the book. It was 500 and something. And he wrote in his diary that night, "Less than the quietest morning on the Western Front." And that's the scale, you see. There is just no comparison whatever.
So that's the executions, I suppose, were the military response to the Rising. There was a political response as well, in that Asquith asked Lloyd George to try his hand at reaching some kind of a settlement. Was that the poisoned chalice being offered?
I don't think it was. Lloyd George, even at that stage, had the reputation of being the best negotiator around, and if anybody could strike a deal, he could strike a deal. Lloyd George was prepared to try, because at that stage he didn't have anything to lose by trying. Nobody ever expected it to succeed. Ireland was, British politicians, including the members of the coalition government, because the first coalition starts in 1915 under Asquith. So nobody really expected him to succeed, and it's the Southern Unionists, not the Ulster Unionists, who bring it down. But he did try, because he knew it would be a great feather in his cap if he succeeded. If he didn't succeed, well, so what? But once he becomes Prime Minister, that's a very different story. He's not prepared to try again, because then he is the person who's got most to lose by the strain that will be placed upon the coalition government by resurrecting the issue of Ireland.
One of the reasons that the executions in 1916 were halted when they were is the concern about the effect on America and American public opinion. And that's obviously in the context of Britain at war, desperate for America to come in on their side. And that's another impact of the war.
Absolutely. I mean, the British view of themselves in the world is changed completely because of the First World War. Because they realized halfway through the First World War that they can no longer tilt the balance of power in Europe. In order to come out on the winning side, they're going to have to get the Americans to help them. So the Americans don't actually join the war until 1917. But you can say from 1916 onwards that what the British call the special relationship, the Anglo-American alliance, is the most important single plank of British foreign policy, which it has remained all the way up until the present time. And that produces a quite different situation, and a situation in which Irish nationalists have a certain leverage they had never had before, pressure that they can exercise through America. The 1916, I mean, the most extraordinary episode in 1916, which shows how obsessed they were with not upsetting the Americans, had to do with Roger Casement, because they were very angry about Casement, who had been knighted. He had been in the British consular service. They felt his involvement in the 1916 Rising was a particular kind of betrayal, and they were determined to execute him. But they didn't want to upset the Americans. So you have the extraordinary aspect, they made photographic copies of the most graphic descriptions of homosexual activity in Casement's diaries. And the Prime Minister, at a luncheon, is pulling this stuff out of his pocket and saying, "You better take a look at this," to the American ambassador, who is shocked beyond words and utterly horrified, and who duly writes to the American president and says, "Look, we can't get involved in it. You have no idea what I've just seen," and so unspeakable. And then, of course, they started peddling all this stuff through the American embassy, through the British embassy in Washington. And there was a naval attaché there, a chap with a sort of James Bond kind of name, Guy Gaunt, I think his name was. And he was peddling these photographs around the place for 2 or 3 weeks after Casement had been executed.
Because Casement had an international reputation, and therefore his execution would have a lot more impact in America.
Yes, and it had to, and it had to. And he was showing it to congressmen, he was showing it to journalists, and he was showing it above all to prelates in the Catholic Church in America.